Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to bring you the 10.2 Season 3 Mythic Plus guide for the Everbloom. This is a Warlords of Draenor dungeon that they turned into a Mythic Plus dungeon for 10.2 in Dragonflight, and we're going to take you through the trash mechanics, the boss fights, and how you can best survive throughout this. You start off by going towards the left at the very beginning of the instance, where there's a number of different casters that you have to watch out for. Menders, of course, have heals to them, while Naturalists are going to be casting Tank Buster casts, which are pretty much chain casting bolts into the tank, while also having these choking vine mechanics that will stun a DPS player usually. You can dispel this as a healer, or you can also use like crowd control effects to be able to stop the casts and put them basically on cooldown to a later moment. You also have stingers, which are jumping out towards the furthest ranged player to apply poisons to them. Make sure if you have multiple ranged players that one isn't just sitting there tanking everything in the instance at the moment. Make sure you have a good amount of poison dispels to help you deal with those. And there's lashers spread throughout the instance that are going to be stacking up these slows onto the tank, which also increase their damage taken. So if you are a healer, for example, you can use Freedom, Tiger's Lust, or even if you're a tank, you can use these on yourself to remove the slow and the increased damage taken at the exact same time. You do usually want to avoid Gnarl Root, as he'll like root players, having to destroy those roots. Otherwise you get caught in these like silence fields that he likes to put up. He's very annoying to be able to deal with, and he's very easy to be able to skip. Many of these mobs in the dungeon are also humanoid, and if they're not humanoid, they do not have true sight, so there's a lot of skip potential throughout this instance. You probably will be skipping a healthy amount of trash throughout, so keep that in mind. The first boss of the dungeon is Witherbark, and this guy is very easy. You want to make sure you're tanking him in a corner, because all of the beachhead area, all of the shoreline is going to spawn these like water globules that are going to try to rejuvenate and rehydrate Witherbark. So when he runs out of energy, he's then going to become more brittle, and then that's your opportunity to be able to deal increased damage. This usually happens, I want to say, about 40 seconds into the fight to about a minute into the fight. And so this is going to be around your opportunity to hit Bloodlust, hit big cooldowns, and be able to burn the boss. These globules are coming from the water area, and in order to stop them, you can either kill them, or you can use these unchecked growth, these like vines that are going to target ranged players, and make sure that they're baited in a nice sort of like protective field almost, to be able to capture these globules as they are spawning. So if you're a ranged player, whether you're a healer or a DPS, you want to make sure that you're baiting all of these vines towards the incoming globules, that they'll then spawn unchecked growth. You don't really need to do a whole lot with these besides tank them, as they deal like a moderate amount of damage to your tank, and then you're going to be able to cleave them down naturally as you're burning the boss as he takes increased damage. Once he fully rehydrates, he goes back to phase 1 once again, and you have to deal with the tank frontal breath, followed up by just the incoming growths that are going to continue spawning. Once you've killed the boss, then you're able to go up the ramp and throughout to the next area of trash. There are a number of very lethal mobs throughout here, but most all of these enemies are also humanoid, so Mind Soothe is extremely OP. The Berserkers are going to leap out to random ranged players and start blade storming on top of them. The damage they deal is insanely high, so I'd recommend pulling maybe 1 or 2 at a time and trying to skip as many of them as you possibly can. And you're also going to have to deal with Naturalists and Menders once again, but also the Abominations, which are going to have unavoidable AoE damage hitting every player and leaving about a 5 or 6 second dot. These enemies, as long as you're pulling them one at a time, are not too bad to deal with, but in conjunction with the Berserkers, they are extraordinarily lethal, and so I think these early weak routes, you want to avoid as many Berserkers as you can. And when you're fighting them, you can use things like Trap, Vortex, Binding Shot, all kinds of these mechanics, all these crowd controls to be able to stop the Berserkers from blade storming onto your ranged players and bring them back into melee very quickly. So they are very susceptible to these crowd controls, and you want to make sure you are burning them down quickly or skipping them as much as you can. Once you get through this area, then you're going to be fighting against the Ancient Protectors. You only have to tank one of the bosses, and that's in the middle, and that's Dulhu. You have to fight up against Earthshaper Tulu and Gola at the same time, where they stand still and basically chain cast abilities. When one is channeling large AoE damage, you want to make sure your team is focusing down and interrupting the other that's spam casting bolts onto your entire player base. Dulhu is going to be charging the tank and then dropping sludge on all players. So ranged and melee want to make sure that they have 2 different stack piles. and these sludge piles will also dissipate over time. So you want to make sure you're kind of baiting them off to the side and making sure that you're able to have space in melee to be able to get back in to hit that target. The strat that we were using is once one of them begins channeling their fury, you then swap targets so that melee and the tanks are able to continue interrupting the opposing caster mob, right? You have to keep in mind that both casters have specials. Gola has a Revitalize, which is a heal, which you always want to make sure you're locking down. And Telu has a mass stun for 5 seconds, so that must get interrupted as well. Usually, if you just set a range player to always focus on these special mechanics, you'll have a considerably easier time dealing with it. And having your tank, of course, alternate between each of these caster mobs quickly so that once one ends their AoE and another one begins, you swap onto the one that is casting bolts onto your players, and then you'll also be in position to shut down those special casts at the exact same time. The damage of this fight is incredibly high, and this is a very easy area for players to be able to wipe. So keep in mind that you have one player assigned to dealing with those special casts from each of those mobs. You can also purge the Revitalize, even though it does a substantial amount of instant healing. You can purge it if the cast does end up going off, but there's no way to be able to remove those stuns as a healer because you're also going to be stunned as well. So keep that in mind. After defeating the protectors, keep in mind, this dungeon no longer has any sort of optional bosses, but it is optional, of course, if you'd like to subscribe to the YouTube channel and continue supporting our awesome content. Check it out right there. But keep in mind, as you're going through the rest of this mage wing at the end of the Everbloom, the assistants are pretty much only dealing like tank buster damage. You can pull just droves of them, but there's Arcanists, there's Frostmancers, and Pyromancers all scattered throughout this area. You want to make sure you mind soothe or walk around as many of these as you possibly can because they're not great percent and you need a crazy amount of kicks to be able to shut them down. Unfortunately, you have to pull one of each of those elements before you're able to engage with Archmage Soul. What this means is you have to deal with an Arcanomancer, Pyromancer, and Frostmancer all at the exact same time before you can pull this boss. Keep in mind that you're going to have the Arcanomancer and Pyromancer both with their own blast and like Pyroblast. You need to interrupt, otherwise somebody gets killed. The Arcanomancer will shoot out an orb, which is also featured on the boss fight, which will target the furthest ranged player. And then the Frostmancer is going to be dropping these ice balls that will also stun players and deal a considerable amount of damage. The Pyromancer has the Cinderbolt salvos, which are projectiles which are flying towards players that deal crazy damage. And all of these mechanics are going to be featured on the boss fight. So make sure you're focusing down one of these casters. Usually we would do the Pyromancer because they dealt the most damage, but this is by far the hardest trash pack that you have to do in the instance at the moment. Once you're ready to face up against Archmage Soul, she is going to alternate between all three of the magical elements. She's going to start by empowering herself with fire and then launching the fire salvos onto all of the players, dealing crazy amounts of damage and spawning void zones, so make sure you have personals at the ready. She will then start doing combinations of abilities. So it starts with only fire, then fire and frost, and the frost is going to be those frost orbs that we saw before, that if you soak any of them, you get a magic debuff and a hefty dot. Then she will go to frost and arcane, and the arcane orb is going to shoot out at the furthest range player, and then when it impacts that location, it's going to suck every player closer to it. Very difficult. After going into between Frost and Arcane, she will then go into Arcane and Fire. You'll have to watch out for the Arcane Orb dragging players into fire circles and dealing even more damage as a salvo is going off. And then the cycle repeats once more, going back to Fire and Frost, then Frost Arcane, then Arcane Fire, then rinse repeat. There's a lot of void zones going out onto this encounter, and you want to make sure you have as much space as you possibly can to be able to maneuver. The challenge is the glacial fusion, the orbs that are spawning around the room are also spawning onto players, and so you need to have everybody kind of moving together to be able to get away from these orbs and to make sure you're not getting dragged into additional ones. Definitely believe this boss is going to have a lot of practice, and for many players, it's just going to be a survival game. Once you defeat Archmage Soul, you'll be able to then skip past a few of these assistants or kill them for your remaining percent as needed, and then move on to Yalnu. Yalnu is very similar to what we saw at a Vortex Pinnacle, having a priority target ad that you need to be able to kill off quickly, but he also features large stomps that are happening at the same time as the ad that he spawns that is dealing lots of party-wide damage. So keep that in mind, that there's these nasty combos that are featured throughout the fight where he's stomping and there's an ad out. So make sure With a healer DPS, everybody needs to be targeting this tree that he spawns and killing it as fast as possible. He'll then have a Genesis cast where he's spreading these little leaflets onto the ground, and you can walk over them to be able to kill them before he reses them, and then they start dealing usually just like tank damage. They're not too terribly heavy, but it's definitely something to make sure that you're watching out for. These Flourishing Ancients deal very, very heavy amount of damage, and they're usually spawning about every minute or so throughout the encounter, so you'll want to make sure you're cycling between output cooldowns and defensives as needed. Make sure you're sort of pooling up resources to kill this mob off as fast as you possibly can. The Genesis cast is also really, really long, so if you're close to killing the boss quite quickly at the end, you can get away with making sure the tank is grabbing all of these lashers as they spawn, the absolute last second kind of surviving for a little while so that you can instead focus on damage. This boss is far from the hardest, like we saw at bosses 2 and 3. Hopefully this guide helped you out with your experience in Everbloom, and let me know if you have any other questions going forward for our M+ guides. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe and check out the Patreon as well, and I'll catch y'all next time.